Good evening. My name is Moustafa Bayoumi, and I am here to introduce Deepa Kumar and her book. And I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank you all for coming out to this event tonight, celebrating the launch of Deepa's book. You all know, of course, that you're going to be more than likely missing Barack Obama's speech tonight, right? So the only thing I can say to that is, good for you. Another thing you will miss is the presence of any Muslim offering a prayer at the DNC convention. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, but okay. Not that I actually think that it's a good idea. In fact, I think we should leave religion out of politics entirely. You can clap to that one if you want. Wow. But at the DNC convention, as you probably are well aware, there will be Catholic, Greek Orthodox, African Methodist, Episcopalian, Jewish, and evangelical benedictions at least, but no Muslims. The DNC, of course, is a lot better than the RNC, where looking for a Muslim in a crowd is as futile as searching for Waldo. It's sort of like, where's Wasim or something, I'm not sure. With the DNC, Muslims are there to be seen, but not heard from. With the RNC and its anti-Sharia plank of its platform, Muslims seem to solely exist to be conquered. I doubt very much President Obama tonight will say anything similar to what he said in 2004 as Senator Obama and the DNC's keynote speaker. Then Obama stated that, quote, and this is a quote from his talk, "If there is an Arab-American family being rounded up without the benefit of an attorney or due process, that threatens my civil liberties." One would think that as president, the idea of preserving civil liberties would be even more important. One would be wrong. Preserving empire seems more like it. The facts are plain to see if we bother to look for them. As the American involvement in its wars in the Middle East and South Asia deepens, Islamophobia is on the rise in this country. Now, any student of logic will tell you that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. But any student of empire will also tell you that the idea of warfare, conquest, and hegemony over different parts of the earth necessitates a cultural component of turning your subjects into savages or children in need of rescue. Anything, in other words, but equals. The vast reach of the American empire, brittle as it is, and I think it is brittle, is a threat to our civil liberties at home and the human rights of others abroad simultaneously. In fact, today there was yet another report released of the American military torturing and waterboarding more people than previously admitted, this time in Libya. There's a decade-long war in Afghanistan that is, and let's use the word, a quagmire. The government of Iraq facilitates the transfer of arms from Iran to Syria. The Israelis routinely bomb Gaza and no one says a thing. And instead, we are supposed to be deathly afraid of the phantom threat that the United States Constitution is about to be usurped by Sharia law. As if our Sex in the City lifestyle will be legislated into women wearing burqas and all of us living in villages, which oddly enough is another Republican platform, if I'm not mistaken. When Anders Behring Breivik murdered 77 people last year in Norway because he believed that the Muslims were taking over, or when Wade Michael Page bursts into a Sikh temple and guns down innocent worshippers, we know that Islamophobia is real, tangible, and deadly. It is part of the political discourse of this country. Now, when was the last time that one of the only two major political parties in this country based part of its platform on the deliberate vilification of a group of its own citizenry? Meanwhile, Muslim Americans have become radioactive to Democrats. You can bet that there won't be a rush to court the Muslim vote this election by the Democrats. By the way, a note to the DNC, rushing to proclaim Jerusalem the capital of Israel is not really a vote-getter for Muslim Americans. What is less remarked upon, but in fact more important, is the connection between civil rights and American foreign policy, between domestic civil rights and American foreign policy. And that's where Deepa Kumar's book comes in. The two are intimately connected. Just consider how the NYPD spying program on Muslim communities in the city, by the way, let me offer a salam alaikum to whoever is covering the event for the NYPD this evening. Was begun, the NYPD spying program was in fact begun by a man on loan from the CIA. So you already see the connections between the foreign and the domestic. If we are really to understand how this country works, at home and abroad, we have to understand the connections between the practices at home and the policies abroad. This unholy alliance of demonizations near and far didn't begin in 2001, but they have assumed a new form of public legitimacy in the intervening decade. Civil rights basically elicits a yawn from the public today because, well, who cares about those Muslims? Aren't they our enemies both here and over there? But I would venture to say that Senator, not Pet President Obama, was right. The denial of the civil liberties of any group and the offhand way that the most casual racism against Muslims in the United States operates is in fact not really a Muslim issue at all. It's everyone's issue. It gets at the heart of what a citizen really is or isn't today in this country. It's about the soul or soullessness of a nation, and it's about the possibilities or impossibilities to forge the destiny that is desperately needed, one that is built on equality and dignity for everybody, here and abroad. And that's where Deepa's book comes in. And I'll let her now tell you more about it.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Moustafa, for that fantastic introduction. So I want to begin by sketching a picture of what has happened over the summer of 2012. We have seen a wave of attacks against Muslims in this country. We have seen mosques in Rhode Island, in Southern California, in Dearborn, Michigan, and elsewhere being targeted. In fact, one mosque in Joplin, Missouri was burned to the ground. We also saw 6 worshippers at a Sikh temple being gunned down and killed. In addition to all of this, we've seen pigs' limbs being thrown at an Islamic center. We have seen homemade chemical bombs being thrown at Muslim school, and sadly the list goes on and on. And according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks and studies hate groups, there has been a 50% rise in hate crimes against Muslims since 2010, and a 300% growth in the number of anti-Muslim hate groups during that same time period. So I think what all this shows is that in the 11 years since 9/11, anti-Muslim racism has not diminished. If anything, it has expanded, it has grown, and particularly so over the last 2 years. And so what I'd like to do in my presentation today is to explain why this is the case, and more importantly, what we can do to fight this persistent and vicious form of racism. And so I've organized my comments around 3 questions. First, what is Islamophobia? Second, where does it come from and who benefits from it? And third, what can we do to fight it? Now, one quick answer to these questions is to say Islamophobia is anti-Muslim bigotry, it arises from the far right and the Republican Party, and what we need to do is expose these bigots and educate people. This is certainly not a wrong explanation. It is not a coincidence that in 2 election years, in 2010 and 2012, we've seen the ratcheting up of anti-Muslim racism because it gets votes. It gets votes for the Republican Party. But this is only part of the answer, I would argue, because when we focus only on the far right and when we focus only on the Republican Party, we miss the larger picture. And so the thrust of my argument in the book, as well as in my comments today, is that we need to deepen our understanding of anti-Muslim racism, and we need to see that it emerges from the structure of American society, or to be more precise, from the project of empire. And so, in case you happen to see the refreshments as you were coming in, the only thing that's holding you back between the delicious food is this little thing called empire. And I have to talk about that because if the answer was as simple as far right bad, Republicans bad, Democrats good, vote Democrat, I could sit down and we could continue to socialize for the rest of the evening, but it is not as simple as that. In fact, I think it's crucial to get to the roots of Islamophobia because we need to actually get to the root causes if we're going to effectively fight against it. And that's actually why I wrote the book. It is not a question of one-upmanship, or I should say one-up-womanship, but it rather flows from my commitment to social justice and to social change. So the first question, what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is anti-Muslim racism. It is the fear and hatred of Muslims, and not just Muslims, but anyone who looks Muslim. There is both a cultural dimension to it and a biological dimension to this. So back in the 19th century, for instance, during the high point of European colonialism, it was the biological dimension that actually dominated. Keep in mind, of course, that during this time, for the first time in human history, Europeans actually went around classifying and categorizing human beings into various species, into various races, based on biological characteristics. Now, guess which race happened to be at the top of this hierarchy? No points for that. It just happened to be Caucasians, it happened to be Europeans, white Europeans, and so on, and every other race or species fell at the bottom of this hierarchy. Now, obviously, this was very handy in terms of justifying colonialism, in terms of justifying empire, because if the white race is superior, then, as Rudyard Kipling put it, it becomes the white man's burden to go off and to civilize and to conquer and to tame these savages, right? In his poem, The White Man's Burden, he refers to colonized peoples as half devil, half child. And by that, of course, he's invoking fear, right? Fear of the devil, but also an infantilization. These are children who need to be civilized, who need to be taught Western values like democracy and so on and so forth. And it's in this context that the notion of Homo Islamicus, that is, Muslims as a species, actually comes into being. Now, of course, even at this time, culture actually plays a large part in this kind of racism. And so a body of knowledge is commissioned by the great European colonial powers. That's called Orientalism, and it comes into being around this time. And Edward Said, the late Edward Said, has written very well about it, and he's argued very convincingly that this body of ideas ultimately served to enable the colonial project, served to enable the aims of empire. Now, the people who were key contributors to this new body of scholarship were philologists. And so what they did is they studied language, they studied texts, and part of the bias of philology is the understanding that you can understand an entire people, how they behave, how they think, and so on, by looking at their texts. So when it came to studying the Middle East, when it came to studying North Africa, it was the text of Islam. It was the holy text of Islam that became the lens through which an entire region of people would be studied and would be understood. And so, you know, if women were oppressed, the Quran was to blame, right? That was the explanation that was given. And of course, this Western obsession with rescuing Muslim women doesn't start in 2001 with the Afghan war, where apparently George Bush, you know, that great champion of women's rights right here in the United States, went off to rescue Afghan women. It didn't start at that point. In fact, this obsession begins in the 19th century. Never mind, of course, that Muslim women have repeatedly said we don't need to be rescued. But suffice it to say that in the 19th century, both biology and culture helped fuel this ideology of racism against Muslims. Now we come into the 20th century, and the notion of biologically identifiable races starts to get questioned. So much so that over the last 30 years, the research into genetics in particular has thoroughly debunked biologically based understandings of race. So in this context, of course, the cultural explanation needed to be resuscitated. And this is where the neo-Orientalists, the Orientalists of today, come into being. One such person is a man by the name of Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis is British. He had a wonderful position teaching in Britain. After the Second World War, he moves to the United States and takes a position here at Princeton University. Because, well, the Orientalists realized that the center of gravity is shifting, and that empire was to move from Britain, from Europe, to the United States. And so they know which way the wind blows, and many Orientalists would migrate to the United States. And Bernard Lewis is actually the author of the term clash of civilizations, which a political scientist by the name of Samuel Huntington would then take up and propagate and popularize. And his thesis was basically this. It was the idea, he said, that in the post-Cold War world, conflict would no longer be characterized by politics, it would be characterized by culture. And so he put forward this idea that there are 7 or 8 civilizations that make up the world. Each have their own unique cultures. And because they're all unique, they are bound to clash. They're bound to come into conflict with one another. And of course, Huntington actually names China, the Confucian civilization, and the Islamic civilization as being the key threats to the West. So let me quote him. Let me give you a sense of what he argues. He says, quote, "The underlying problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism, it is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power." So for Huntington, it was very clear. It's about culture. Culture is what makes up the basis for conflicts going forward. And he goes on to argue, and I'll give you one more quote, what is it that defines the West? What are the cultural characteristics that are unique to the West? Well, here's how he puts it. He says, Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free markets, the separation of church and state, often have little resonance in Islamic societies. And so here we have a picture of the West as everything wonderful, and the East, of course, as savage, as barbaric, and so on. Of course, someone should have told the people of Egypt and Tunisia and Syria who've been fighting for democracy, against dictatorship, for human rights, and so on, that, you know what, these ideas actually have no place in your societies, but apparently the memo didn't get there. At any rate, anti-Muslim racism today is largely cultural. It's based on the understanding that those who practice Islam are automatically driven to certain things. One such myth is the idea that Muslims are automatically driven to violence. Let me give you an example of how this works. When Major Nidal Hassan took out a gun and killed 13 of his comrades, and there was really no attempt to explain why this might have happened, right? There was no search inside his mind to say what might have been going on in the mind of an army psychiatrist who deals with so many people suffering from PTSD. How did that impact him? How did that lead him to do maybe what he did? There was no search for external explanations, such as what does it feel like to be a Muslim in the US military? What about all the racist harassment that he faced? None of this stuff apparently was necessary to trying to understand why he might have done this. And so whenever Muslims do something in the mainstream, the answer is obvious. Islam is to blame, and we shall look no further. And actually in the book, I look at 5 such myths that began in the 18th, 19th century and that continue to persist today as well. And to really underscore the hypocrisy of this way of portraying and understanding Muslims, I think we should just look at how the Batman killer, James Holmes, was portrayed in the mainstream media. People know, of course, the shootings that took place outside the Batman film in Colorado. Well, there was a lot of soul searching. You know, why is it that this graduate student, this seemingly nice, quiet guy, why would he do this kind of thing? The same sort of treatment is not meted out to Muslims when they do such thing. Or even look at Wade Page. Wade Page is this neo-Nazi. I actually read some about him. One of his videos, he was a musician, right? He was the leader of a band. It's part of this underground network of the far right of neo-Nazis called Hate Corps. And it's one of the, sort of the key recruiting grounds for neo-Nazi groups and so on. I mean, this guy's an equal opportunity hater, and one of his videos, he's got a noose hanging in the background, right? But even for somebody like this, you know, there's a sense, what went wrong? How could he have possibly become like this? His stepmother is interviewed, saying this is what he's like as a child, and so on and so forth. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that white people, and white men in particular, when they commit atrocities, the typical framework that's used is this is a random, senseless act, and we need to try to make sense of it. But when Muslims are involved in any such thing, immediately the answer is that Islam is to blame. I want to give a few more examples of cultural racism. France banned first the headscarf, the hijab, in schools, and then went on to banning the veil itself. In fact, symbols of Islam in general came to be seen as intolerable, but it wasn't put that way. The way that it was put is that this is about defending secularism, or this is about rescuing Muslim women, asking them to not wear the veil and the hijab and so on is about emancipating them. In other words, liberal ideas have long been used to justify racist actions. Another quick example, Switzerland banned, by popular vote I might add, the construction of new minarets in that country. And of course, as we know, Switzerland is just rife with minarets everywhere, right? You can't see the banks, you can't see the fondue houses, just minarets everywhere, right? Wrong. There are all but 4 minarets in that country, and nevertheless, they went ahead and carried out this ban. So this attack on the symbols of Islam is really about seeing Islam and Muslims as outsiders, as alien presences in the West that must be rooted out. And this is the argument made by the far right, or they must be controlled. And this is the argument made by moderates and liberals. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that the rise of Islamophobia in Europe has been accompanied by an attack on multiculturalism. And really, this is what the far right in this country has been trying to do, is to bring that dimension to the United States. And this is why they've chosen to target mosques, to introduce legislation that bans the use of Muslim or Sharia law, and so on and so forth. Now, the last thing I want to say in terms of explaining what Islamophobia is that this form of racism does not impact only Muslims. As I said earlier, it impacts Muslims and anyone who supposedly looks Muslim. So the murders in Oak Creek, Wisconsin really are a product of this sort of attitude. And this is not the first time that Sikhs have been targeted in this country. In fact, the very first murder that happened 4 days after 9/11 was a Sikh gas station owner, right? And this has continued ever since 9/11. And as people may know, the Sikh religion is not a branch of Islam, it's its own religion. But Sikh men have been targeted because they look Muslim. That is, they have turbans, they have beards, and so Sikh Americans have reported being called terrorists, being likened to Osama bin Laden. They have faced both verbal as well as physical abuse. In addition to this, I think it's important to mention that Christians from the Middle East, from North Africa and elsewhere, Zoroastrians, Hindus from South Asia have also faced this kind of racism. So there is, I want to say, a biological dimension as well, in that brown-skinned people, and particularly brown-skinned men, have automatically come to be seen as suspicious. Right, question number 2. Where does it come from and who benefits? Now, it's easy to identify the rabid racists, and these are people who say things like Muslims are conspiring to take over the United States, they've infiltrated the government, and so on. Their racism is obvious, it's straightforward, it's blatant. But I want to argue that there are actually 2 forms that anti-Muslim racism takes in this country. There is, on the one hand, the blatant and conservative form, and on the other hand, there's the more subtle and liberal form. And I think it's important to understand both and to pay attention to both. Let's talk first about the obvious form. Now, in the latter part of the summer of 2012, billboards and signs on buses and subway trains started to appear first in San Francisco and then in New York City, stating that Muslims are savages, they are uncivilized, they are violent murderers, and so on. And the people behind this are part of a well-funded network of Islamophobes. They have amassed tens of millions of dollars to carry on this kind of work from various racist donors. And they are actually the ones who go around instigating attacks on Muslims and on symbols of Islam. Now, I want to say a little bit about this Islamophobic network, because we have to know who these people are so that we can counter them every time they show up somewhere. This network is a loose coalition of 4 groups that have come together to make war on Muslims. First, and this is the intellectual center, a section of the neoconservatives of the foreign policy establishment, particularly a man by the name of Frank Gaffney, who runs an institute called the Center for Security Policy. This center actually sort of issues all the talking points that then get taken up. So it's the nerve center of the brain center, if you will. So that's one section, the neocons. Second, we have the Christian right. the evangelicals, the Jerry Falwells, the Franklin Grahams. People may recall Franklin Graham calling Islam a wicked and evil religion. You know, this is normal speech for people like Franklin Graham and others. So that's the second group. Third, we have the Zionist right. We have people like Daniel Pipes, people like David Horowitz. Horowitz has written and spoken about how Muslim student organizations on campuses across the United States, he says that these are front groups for the Muslim Brotherhood. He says they look moderate, they look normal, but actually they're just waiting to pounce on Christians and Jews and so on. And there's this vast conspiracy, and we've got to be careful about these people. And the last group in this network are ex-Muslims and Christians. These are people that you might call opportunists, collaborators, or as Hamid Dabashi puts it, native informants. People who basically profit from bashing the country of their origin. I'll just give you one quick example. Bridget Gabriel, for instance, is the founder of a very active group called, appropriately, Act for America. There are 500 chapters of Act for America all around the United States. And here is, you know, she goes around the country giving talks all over the place. And the importance of people like her, as well as other ex-Muslims, is that they legitimate the racist ideology that comes from the other sections. They say, yes, I know, I've lived there, and I know that Muslims are horrible and they're murderers and so on and so forth. And so let me quote Gabriel. She was speaking at a counterterrorism event at Duke University, and she was trying to explain the differences between Arabs and Muslims on the one hand and Israelis on the other. And here's how she puts it. She said, quote, "It's barbarism versus civilization, it's democracy versus dictatorship, it's goodness versus evil." So no subtlety of any sort. It's pretty clear where she's coming from. And it's not a coincidence, really, that this sort of rhetoric, this was a statement from 2004, it's very similar to one of the bus ads, if you've seen it. It says, in the war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, defend Israel. And so these ideas have long been cultivated by this far right, and it's now getting thrown out there. And by the way, just a quick point to say that the Likud right and the settler community in Israel has also contributed to the development of this language. Right. Now, the Islamophobic network by themselves would probably not get it very far, but the key is that their message gets amplified in the mainstream by right-wing Republicans who have very close ties to them. These are people like Bachmann, these are people like Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich, Alan West, Peter King, you get the idea. And so earlier this year, when Michelle Bachmann, in what I can only say is a move that Joseph McCarthy would have been proud of, basically said that Hillary Clinton's aide, a woman by the name of Huma Abedin, is a Muslim Brotherhood infiltrator, if you will, and that she and others have infiltrated the US government. You remember McCarthyism, right? This is how McCarthyism operated. Senator McCarthy would say, "In my hand, I am holding the list of blah, blah, blah communists who have infiltrated the government," and so forth. Now, it's easy to dismiss her as a lunatic, because even people within the Republican Party, particularly John McCain, Boehner, and others, actually came out and denounced her and attacked her and so on. The fact of the matter is that racism has been central to the Republican Party machinery because it works for them. Today, 34% of conservative voters believe that President Obama is a Muslim. And this number, by the way, is up from 16% back in 2008. So this is a clearly cultivated strategy. And I've argued that this is really the inclusion of Muslims into the Southern strategy. Just very quickly, what is the Southern strategy? The Southern strategy was developed by the Republican Party back in the 1960s. It was a way to tap into the anxiety of white voters in the South and their anxieties, particularly after the civil rights movement, to win their votes through coded appeals to anti-African American racism. And so the center point of this strategy was the idea that African American men are criminals, and that they should be locked up and the keys should be thrown away, and vote for the Republican Party, we'll keep you safe, we are tough on crime, and so forth. And now, what was a coded racist strategy used against African Americans has now become a blatant racist strategy used against Muslims. So it shouldn't surprise us that the GOP convention in August, their platform included a statement on banning the use of foreign law in the US, and it doesn't take a genius, in my view, to figure out that by foreign law, what they meant is Sharia law or Muslim law. I think it also doesn't take a genius to figure out that Republicans have created a climate in this country during this election year, which really has directly, I would argue, fueled hate crimes. Quick example, when Illinois Representative Joe Walsh said, and I'm quoting him, "Islam is not the peaceful, loving religion we hear about. There is a radical strain of Islam in this country trying to kill Americans every week." He said this back in August. Within a week of these comments, gunshots were heard outside a mosque in Illinois, and a homemade chemical bomb was thrown at a Muslim school. So these are the blatant and obvious forms of racism, and anyone who is anti-racist can immediately identify them and condemn these kinds of speech, this kind of speech and these kind of actions. And so that's all I'll say about this, and I want to instead move on to the more subtle forms. Now, I said earlier that 34% of conservative GOP voters believe that Obama is Muslim. And this figure is twice the number that it was back in 2008. So while the far right and while the Republican Party has been instrumental in mobilizing this idea, both candidate Obama and President Obama have played a part in taking this further. So during the 2008 campaign trail, he was, quote unquote, accused of being a Muslim. How did he respond? He said, no, I'm not a Muslim, I'm Christian, I've been going to the same church for the last 20 years, and so on. What's wrong with responding that way? Well, what's wrong with responding that way is it creates the impression that there's something wrong with being Muslim. I mean, again, think back to the Cold War, think back to McCarthyism. You were accused of being a communist, or you were accused of having communist sympathies, and the only way to respond is to say, no, I'm not a communist, I'm not a communist sympathizer. And this strategy really was a way to discredit you, to discredit the person, but also to discredit an entire set of ideas, right? And that's the accusatory style of McCarthyism. Now, instead of pushing back, the correct way, I would argue, to have responded to this was to say, there's nothing wrong with being Muslim. I have Muslim relatives. And, you know, why does this matter? How is this relevant to this election or to my presidency or whatnot? But sadly, that is not how President Obama or candidate Obama responded to these questions. In fact, during his campaign, he carefully avoided visiting mosques, declining every invitation. And as far as I know, to date, he has not visited a single mosque in the United States. In fact, at one of his campaign stops, the strategy was even more deliberate. There were two women wearing hijabs who were standing behind him, and they would have been part of the TV frame. Very quickly, his handlers went and told them to move out of the frame so that, you know, they're not part of the picture. Now, when the Aurora shootings in Colorado took place, Obama went to visit Colorado. He went to visit the victims' families, but he didn't do the same when the Sikh families were killed. After some criticism, Michelle Bachmann was dispatched to go. I'm sorry?
Michelle Obama.
Michelle Obama, sorry. Of course. Michelle Obama, his wife, was dispatched to go and do the needful. Now, this is not blatant, but it nevertheless contributes to a climate where Muslims and people who look Muslim are treated differently, quite frankly, than white people. And the reality is that the Democratic Party has at best been silent about Islamophobia, and at worst has fanned the flames of this racism. Because I think that both these approaches, being silent and contributing to it, actually plays a part in allowing the far right to grow. And the dynamic is basically one where liberal Islamophobia at the top of society enables and strengthens reactionary and conservative Islamophobia at the bottom. Let me give an example to illustrate how this dynamic actually works. I'm going to talk very briefly about the 2010 so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy. People may remember this. This was when there was a proposal to build a community center called Park 51 or Cordoba House, 2.5 long blocks away from the site of the former World Trade Center. And it was fine until the far right got involved, particularly this woman by the name of Pamela Geller in Stop Islamization of America, this group that she and Robert Spencer heads. And essentially, she would play a leading role in attacking this proposed community center and arguing that it shouldn't come up. Here is how she put it. I'm going to quote her. About Park 51, she says, "This is Islamic domination and expansionism. The location is no accident, just as Al-Aqsa was built on top of the temple in Jerusalem." And so there you have it. And immediately, of course, Frank Gaffney comes in with his framing of this issue. This is what he says. He says, quote, "The Ground Zero Mosque is designed to be a permanent, in-our-face beachhead for Sharia, a platform for inspiring the triumphalist ambitions of the faithful." And he's given the talking points. Newt Gingrich would repeat this on Fox News. Daniel Pipes would repeat this, saying that the building reeks of Islamic triumphalism, and so on and so forth. And very soon, what was part of the right-wing echo chamber gets transferred into the mainstream media because people like Gingrich and Palin and others have access to the mainstream media. Here's how Gingrich put it. He says, quote, "Nazis don't have the right to put up a sign next to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We would never accept the Japanese putting up a site next to Pearl Harbor. There is no reason to accept a mosque next to the World Trade Center." And you step back and you think about that for a second. What is he really saying here? He is saying that Muslims are like Nazis, because if we can't allow the Nazis to build something next to the Holocaust Museum, by extension, we shouldn't allow Muslims to build a symbol of Islam next to the World Trade Center. So what is this if not the wholesale demonization of Muslims and a process by which all Muslims are blamed for the actions of a handful of fundamentalists, right? That's the argument, that's the process at work. And the question is, how do the Democrats actually respond to it? Well, at best, they argued for religious freedom. Nancy Pelosi does that. But very soon, as the far right starts to push more and more, the rhetoric shifts. So that President Obama, who started by supporting this project, would then shift gears and actually change his mind and say that he thinks that the center should be built in a less controversial location. Howard Dean, who is seen as one of the leading liberal figures in the Democratic Party, said, quote, "This is an affront to the people who lost their lives at 9/11. And so again, what do we see? We see both sides in agreement that there is something wrong with building a symbol of Islam close to the site of the former Trade Center, both in agreement that somehow all Muslims are to blame for the events of 9/11. So in this context, where there was no principled defense of Muslims, led to a situation where the far right was able to set the terms of discussion, and not surprisingly, large majorities in this country, somewhere between 40 and 70%, actually came out against the construction of this center. And since that moment, by the way, since 2010 and the so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy, the far right has grown, this Islamophobic network has grown, and they've gone on to attacking mosques and community centers all around the country. Now, in the book, I actually call this network and these people the new McCarthyites, because I think their role really is to push the envelope in the same way that McCarthy did. That is to say, McCarthyism was not the product of one out-of-control senator, but in fact was a very convenient tool in the context of the Cold War, because it enabled this sort of rhetoric to be put forward. And it was tolerated and accepted by both parties, by Democrats and by Republicans. So McCarthyism was crucial to prosecuting the Cold War. Islamophobia has now become useful to prosecuting the war on terror. And the new McCarthyites are very useful in pushing the envelope and in ratcheting up the rhetoric. And make no mistake about it, both parties are committed to the project of US imperialism. Both believe that the US should act in the interests or act in its own interests around the world and shape the world in its own image. I'm going to very quickly speak about the debate within the foreign policy establishment. There, if one can call it that. In the foreign policy establishment, broadly speaking, there are two wings. There is the neoconservatives, the neocons that we're all familiar with, and then there are the realists, the balance of forces realists. Now, both these wings actually believe in American exceptionalism. And what is that? Here's how one scholar defines it. He says, quote, American exceptionalism is a pervasive faith in the uniqueness, immutability, and superiority of the country's founding liberal principles, accompanied by a conviction that the United States has a special destiny among nations. Right? So both the Democrats and the Republicans, both the neocons and the realists actually are committed to this idea. Where there are differences, it is largely in terms of rhetoric and in terms of strategy. And so I'm going to quote Stephen Walt, who actually describes the differences between these two wings really well. Here's how he puts it. He says, quote, the only important intellectual difference between neoconservatives and liberal interventionists is that the former have disdain for international institutions. And so the former, that is the neoconservatives, are unilateralists. They believe that the US should act anywhere it wants in the world, to hell with the rest of the world. Now, that was not Stephen Walt, that was me. To continue with Walt's quote, he says, and the latter, the liberal interventionists, see them as a useful way to legitimate American dominance, i.e., international institutions are useful to legitimate American dominance. Both groups extol the virtue of democracy. Both groups believe that US power, especially its military power, can be a highly effective tool of stagecraft. Both groups are deeply alarmed at the prospect that WMDs might be in the hands of anybody but the United States and its closest allies, and both groups think it is America's right and responsibility to fix lots of problems around the world. And the way he puts it is that liberal interventionists are just kinder, gentler neocons, and the neocons are just liberal interventionists on steroids. And I think that captures that quite well. And so it shouldn't surprise us that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was bipartisan support for the war on terror. And here's how Condoleezza Rice, who back then was Bush's national security advisor before she'd go on to becoming Secretary of State, here's how she put it about what 9/11 means in terms of politics. She says, quote, I think this period is analogous to 1945 to 1947 in that the events started shifting the tectonic plates in international politics, and it's important to seize on that and position American interests and institutions before they harden again. In other words, what was a tragedy for the vast majority of us was an opportunity to be seized on and capitalized by the political elite in this country. And so a team of people were assembled to rhetorically respond to the tragedy of 9/11. This included Bernard Lewis, by the way, who was called to the White House, as well as a bunch of others, policymakers, journalists, and so on. And it's out of this teamwork that the War on Terror label was created. And what it does is it basically gives carte blanche authority to the political elite in this country to carry out endless wars against anyone who's not only anyone, meaning not only the terrorist enemy, the menacing Muslim terrorist enemy, but any country that harbors this enemy as well. And coincidentally, just by sheer chance, the place that we can find these terrorist enemies just happens to be in a region that's oil rich. But you know, this is just a coincidence. I'm kidding. Okay, so this rhetoric actually works in the same way as the Cold War. The fear generated against communists, against Reds, now becomes the fear generated against Muslims or against Greens, if you will. I call it a green scare in the book. And the spectacle of fear gets generated again and again. And I call this a spectacle because the facts actually show otherwise. the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security, which actually receives funds from the Department of Homeland Security, they did a comprehensive study of terrorism in the 10 years after 9/11. And what they found is that Muslim Americans, 11 Muslim Americans, were responsible for the deaths of 33 other people, right? Just think about that. And let's put that into perspective. During the same time period, 150,000 Americans were murdered in this country. Muslim Americans were responsible for 33 of them. And yet, this is not how Muslims are talked about in this country. In fact, an elaborate charade is constructed and played out again and again to keep us afraid. And in case we forget, there are signs everywhere that if we see something, we should say something. And of course, we all know what this something is because we have been taught and inculcated again and again and again. Now, at the end of the day, both Democrats and Republicans participate in this charade. When Obama was getting ready to send another 30,000 more troops into Afghanistan in 2010, here is how he put it in order to justify this escalation. He said, quote, "I'm convinced that our security is at stake in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is the epicenter of violent extremism practiced by Al-Qaeda. It is from here that we were attacked on 9/11, and it is from here that new attacks are being plotted as I speak. This is no idle danger, no hypothetical threat. In the last few months alone, we have apprehended extremists within our borders who were sent here from the border region of Afghanistan and Pakistan to commit new acts of terror." And I looked at the speech in relation to Bush's speech at West Point, and there's really not that much difference. The only difference is that back then, Bush wasn't focusing on terrorists in our midst. Right? The way he put it is we need to fight them there so that we don't have to fight them here. Whereas this turn towards homegrown terrorism is one that largely happens under the Obama administration. In short, both Republicans and Democrats find Islamophobia in justifying imperialism, but being tough on terror is not a tactic that is a stranger to the Democratic Party. After all, Obama's orders to execute Osama bin Laden is touted again and again to bolster his tough on crime credentials. And it wasn't really an accident that the kill lists were leaked. People might know the kill list. It basically was a story that was exposed by the New York Times, which showed President Obama poring over biographies of suspected terrorists, actually personally involved in picking who would be killed, who would be struck down in drone strikes. This was not an accidental leak. This was again a way to bolster his stuff on terror credentials. And again, this shouldn't come as a surprise to us. I said earlier, if the Southern strategy was developed by the Republican Party, very soon the Democrats would also be using it to position themselves as being tough on crime. And the same has happened in this case. If the Republicans have positioned themselves as being tough on terror during the Bush administration, it has now become a platform adopted by the Democrats as well. And there's also another dimension to this. When a country goes to war with an external enemy, it inevitably turns against people that it sees as domestic representatives of those enemies. So let's recall what happened to Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans, by the way, the vast majority US citizens, were put into concentration camps, young, old, middle-aged, and so on. And these camps, if you read about them, they were actually really makeshift, horrible places. There was no plumbing, there was no water facilities, and so on. Doesn't matter. Pearl Harbor happened. All Japanese Americans are guilty. Let's lock them up. Let's throw the keys away. And that's exactly what happens to Muslims after the attack of 9/11. Now, what this rhetoric has done is it has allowed for the overhaul of the legal system in this country so that indefinite detention, deportation, spying, racial profiling, and so on is now perfectly legal. It's now perfectly possible to do these things. And in fact, the reality of these practices have turned the lives of Muslim Americans into a nightmare. And again, I want to emphasize both Democrats and Republicans have participated in this process. Now, the last thing I'll say about this before turning to the final part of my talk is that the key difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on the question of Islamophobia is rhetoric, right? So Obama, in fact, has given some excellent speeches denouncing Islamophobia. I believe he was the first president to actually acknowledge Muslims in the United States. I don't think any other president has done so at an inaugural address. He then flew off to Cairo, where he gave a fantastic speech denouncing the clash of civilizations rhetoric, talking about the contributions that Muslim empires and Muslims themselves have made to world history and to world politics and so forth. Really good speech. I suggest you read it. And he's also very sophisticated rhetorically. He will not use words like crusade in the way that Bush used to throw these terms around. And as a result, he has succeeded to some extent in convincing people that he is a champion of the rights of Muslims. But in fact, if you look behind this rhetoric, you will find that the reality is that Obama adopted Bush's second-term policies pretty much in total. I'll give a quick example. If Bush began the process of indefinite detention, and by the way, what does it mean to indefinitely detain somebody? It means that they don't get their day in court, which is a fundamental right, habeas corpus, which came into being, I believe, in the 10th century, almost a millennium ago, is based on the idea that if somebody is arrested, they have a right to come before a judge, to make a case on their behalf, and to let go if they haven't done anything wrong. When Bush overturned that and sanctioned indefinite detention, he took us back a millennium. President Obama, candidate Obama, said he's going to overturn all of these things. He hasn't. In fact, the National Defense Authorization Act now makes it legal to indefinitely detain not just immigrants, but US citizens as well. And so I think as this election season approaches, the thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we vote for the lesser evil, we get both the lesser evil and the worse evil at the same time. And so I'm going to turn to the final part of my talk, which is what do we do? Now, in the late 1980s, it was under the Reagan administration, fully 4 decades after the incarceration of Japanese Americans, that an apology was finally issued to them. You know, sorry we did this, we shouldn't have done this, and so forth. Now, some people have argued that the reason this apology was issued is because Japanese Americans went out of their way to integrate themselves into American society, to be model citizens, to be a model minority, and so forth. And I would actually disagree with this. Certainly that doesn't hurt, but that is not the reason why this apology was issued. Instead, I would argue that once Japan was eliminated as a threat to the US on the international stage, such an apology could be issued without consequences, with very little price to be paid for the elite in this country. And by the way, this is not some principled apology for anti-Asian racism in this country, because at the same time as this apology was issued to Japanese Americans, China is starting to emerge as the new threat, or at least the new potential threat of the United States, and you start to see anti-Chinese rhetoric, particularly in the 90s and going forward, starting to come into being. Now, in the case of Islamophobia, as long as oil continues to be an important energy resource, and the Middle East, the key source of this resource, anti-Muslim racism is going to be used again and again to justify US imperialism. And so our struggle, I think, is threefold. There are many people in this room who have participated in this struggle, and I'm not going to talk in any great detail because I've already spoken for a while. I hope that in the discussion section people will speak to their own experiences and strategy and tactics that they've used, but I'll quickly outline 3 things that I think we should do to fight Islamophobia. First, we have to fight the far right. Wherever these people raise their heads, we have to build an opposition and drive them out. So back in 2010, when Pamela Geller and Stop Islamization of America was militating against Park 51, many groups in New York City formed a grassroots coalition, a couple of grassroots coalitions. We built demonstrations and we successfully got rid of them. Park 51 was constructed a few months ago. So that is crucial and important to do everywhere that the far right is attacking Muslims and symbols of Islam. Second, We have to defend the civil liberties of Muslim Americans that has been badly eviscerated over the last decade. And this work really has largely been led by families of victims and by progressive lawyers, and everyone needs to be a part of this work. And I think that an important development over the last year or so is the connections that activists are making between, on the one hand, anti-Muslim racism and racism that other groups in society, particularly African Americans and Latinos, also face. So in New York City, for instance, the NYPD spying program and its harassment of Muslims is being connected to the stop and frisk policies, which disproportionately affects African Americans and Latinos, is being connected to police brutality and police murder. And this kind of solidarity work is vital and necessary if we're going to fight racism in all its forms. And finally, I think we need to rebuild an anti-war movement and an anti-imperialist movement. We have heard over the last few months, over the course of the summer of 2012, saber-rattling against Iran, saber-rattling against Iran. And I think we have to organize to stop the collective punishment that is being meted out to Iranians through the sanctions regimes, because ultimately sanctions affect ordinary people, not the leadership. And I think we also have to organize to say no to an Israeli-US war on that country. And fundamentally, our ability to build such a movement involves a rejection of Islamophobia. Let me explain why that is very quickly. If you look at how this debate is actually framed, it is that Iran cannot be trusted to have nuclear weapons. And of course, Iran does not have nuclear weapons. It's freely admitted that all it's doing is enriching fuel. In fact, in August, the IAEA released a report which said that even though it may have more centrifuges today, the form in which fuel is being enriched is not the kind that can be used in weapons. But never mind all that. Let's continue to pay for war and for threatening actions and so on. Now, how does that work? It works basically by using one of the myths I discussed earlier, which is the idea that the West is rational, the West can be trusted with nuclear weapons, but these Muslims are crazy, violent, fanatical, rabid, irrational people, and so they should be controlled and they should be policed. That basically is the crux of what is going on in this particular debate. And so I think we have to reject this notion, and we have to question actually the moral authority of the United States, the only country to have ever actually used an atomic bomb, killing large numbers of civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What gives the United States the right to police other countries and to police other people? And so I'm going to come to a close actually by reading the last two paragraphs of the book. And here's what I say. At the end of the day, the vast majority of ordinary people around the world are forced to live under a profoundly unjust and unequal system. The year 2011 showed that this system and its warped priorities would not go unchallenged. The uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt spread not only to other countries in the region, but also to Europe and the United States. Protesters learned strategy and tactics from one another as public spaces became key focal points for the movements. From Tahrir Square in Egypt to Pearl Square in Bahrain, the Puerto del Sol in Madrid, Syntagma Square in Athens, and Zuccotti Park in New York City, protest movements self-consciously honored one another through solidarity greetings and imitation of tactics. Despite local differences, all the movements were directed against the regime of the 1%. Instead of feeling pity for their Arab brothers and sisters, people in the West took inspiration from the successes of their counterparts in Tunisia and Egypt. In place of the white man's burden, a politics of international solidarity began to come into being. The last time that people from around the world stood up together was almost half a century ago. The national liberation struggles that swept the world from India to Algeria in the post-war period rattled the centers of imperialism, even as struggles were beginning to emerge inside Europe and the United States. Today, we are entering a similar era. This is an era of revolution that brings with it the potential to create a brand new society free of racism and war. A new world where every individual, regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion, will be treated with respect. A world where the ideology of Islamophobia will be dumped into the dustbin of history, and that will be the end of that. Thank you.
Deepa, I had a question. You kind of alluded to a similarity between discrimination in McCarthyism and that in currently in Islamophobia. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, very weird, but if you could speak a little bit about the illusion of a kind of difference between terror and crime and the transformation from the war on drugs to the war on terror.
I just want to take the focus off the two-party system because I felt like too much of the talk was on that and more about the American Muslims in general. I was curious as to Muslim scholarship, your response. Tariq Ramadan had a great little quote for your book, but I was curious as to when you were writing it and when the news about it, the reaction by people like Sheikh Hamza Youssef and Imam Zaid Shakir, people like that. And I just want to say, lastly, just really quick, I believe the onus needs to be put more on the American Muslim community, which I am one of them, to write more books and not be apologists. There are many people like Cyrus and many students that are active, and I think the only answer is really for the left in this community and more Muslims, practicing Muslims, all kinds of Muslims, to have more communication and more dialogue.
Just a quick question. As you said, Obama's speech in Cairo was excellent, well delivered, well said. What do you think caused the sharp right turn as soon as he got back to Washington?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. I'll get to each of them, and they're big questions, by the way, so I won't be able to do justice to them. But let me start with the last question first. It was not a switch so much as Obama was doing exactly what he should have been doing. Basically, what you see in Bush's second term is that the neocon vision is pretty much in shambles, right? They thought they would go to Iraq, regime change in Syria, Iran, and the entire region would come under their control. Doesn't happen, doesn't work out that way. In fact, even allies in Europe are alienated, right? Remember the term old Europe is used to refer to European nations that don't want to go along with the war in Iraq and so on. So their vision was pretty much in shambles. And so in the second part of, in Bush's second term, there's actually a shift away from this kind of naked, aggressive imperialism to winning hearts and minds. And it's General Petraeus who comes up with the counterinsurgency doctrine, which is the idea that you need to win hearts and minds. You can't just go in there and bomb and kill everyone and expect to actually rule and colonize the people and so forth. So that shift was already starting to take place. And actually all the way back in 2007, a policy group that was headed by Madeleine Albright and others called Changing Directions in the Muslim World argued this. It basically said that the US image is badly damaged around the world. This image of US empire needs to be rehabilitated. And so the next democratic president, whoever he or she is, should make sure to reject the clash of civilizations rhetoric, should be sure, and by the way, this is in the document, to mention Muslims in their inaugural address. So it was not surprising that, and I've documented all of this in the book, and so it was not surprising that when Obama gets elected, this is what he would do. But in practice, of course, the policies are the same. He simply takes on and continues the policies of the second term of Bush. The US was already withdrawing from Iraq. Obama tries to continue to stay there a little longer, tries to bully Iraq into extending the status of forces agreements. He escalates the war in Afghanistan. He completely accelerates the use of drone strikes. During Bush's second term, he used about 50 drone strikes. Obama has used 5 times that amount in 4 years, and he's extended the theater of war to not just Afghanistan and Pakistan, but to Yemen, to Somalia, and so on. And even domestically, the policies have gotten worse. So it was not a shift, it was simply a continuation in practice, but a shift in rhetoric. Very quickly on reactions from Muslim scholars, from the Muslim community. The book has just been out for about 6 weeks. Tariq Ramadan, as you said, has given a good and generous blurb for this book. I was invited to speak as a keynote speaker at CARE Miami's banquet. I unfortunately couldn't go, but I will be speaking for them. And I'm hopeful that CARE is the Center for American Islamic Relations, and I'm open to working with them, future talks. We may have disagreements, but that's fine. We can have them in a polite way. Ultimately, we're both committed to the idea of fighting Islamophobia. Finally, the huge question on McCarthyism, the war on terror, the war on crime, and so forth. They're not identical. The language of the Red Scare, the language of McCarthyism, of course, has its own unique twists, based on that particular context. But what is central and what unites the two of them is fear-mongering. Always, it's been about fear-mongering. So back during the Cold War, if there are people who are old enough to remember this, one of the things that was done, there was this drill where an alarm would go off and kids would be taught to duck underneath their desks. Why? Because that's the way you prepare for a nuclear bomb being dropped by the Soviet Union. Now, whatever the marginal benefits of that little desk, from protecting you, this is not about protecting children from a nuclear bomb. This is about fear. And this is about inculcating that fear so that people can give their consent to the Cold War, to the various hot wars that would punctuate that period. That's the same thing in this context. The spectacle of fear gets generated about Muslims and these lurking Muslim terrorists who apparently are everywhere. And so we should be suspicious of them, we should fear them, and so forth. And so it's fundamentally about war, it's about empire, and it's about the need to both demonize as well as inculcate fear.
This is a very kind of difficult situation that Muslim Americans are placed in. And you mentioned that one of the groups that fund and actually are active in the sort of demonization of Islam is an ultra-Zionist group. Now, how does someone talk about something like that without offending our partners, many of them who happen to be Jewish, and without diverting this demonization tag onto Judaism per se? America has proven to be very easily convinced of others' negativities, and so if someone was to write and say an ultra-Zionist effort because the demonization of the other who might affect Israeli policy or existence, for instance. So how do you do that without hurting your friends, without hurting the people who've struggled so hard for this country's liberties by the creation of the NAACP and the civil rights movement, etc.?
So the material support law has been used to prosecute many American Muslims and others, and we have seen that over the last decade. And in the case of my father, it's been used to not only prosecute, but imprison him for 65 years. As you've heard about the Holy Land Foundation case, my father was the co-founder, and that case was dragged through a decade-long kind of trial after trial, many years of prosecution, and it ended with a 65-year sentence. And it is now being, it's under appeal and is now being pushed to the Supreme Court. But we've seen laws like the material support, and you mentioned something that I thought was very interesting, which was that in the case of the Japanese, we saw that Japan and shifted in U.S. policy. And so my question is what do you think it's going to take for the politics of today that are very obviously not only anti-Palestinian, but anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-human rights? What is it going to take for these politics to change? Is my father going to have to wait 40 years, as in the case of some Japanese Americans, to be released?
Could I ask you, actually, for people who don't know, and you're probably the best person then to say, if you could give a very, very short description of what the Holy Land case is?
The Holy Land Foundation was the largest Muslim charity in the U.S. until the Bush administration shut it down 3 months after 9/11. And the main kind of, they were mainly accused of providing charity in the form of humanitarian aid, food, medicine, blankets, to Palestinian charities that were deemed fronts for Hamas, which is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. And so the first trial was in 2008. That ended with a hung jury, but then the case was retried the following year. Sorry, the first trial was 2007. There were so many cases involved. It was tried the following year. It ended in all guilty verdicts, and my father, along with 4 other men who were called the Holy Land Five, were then sentenced, all put in communications management units. Again, all a part of the same thing that Deepa is talking about. It's all part of the same, it's all on the same wavelength. And so that's a little bit about the case. It's like many other cases being, it's under review.
My question is actually related to a lot of what we were talking about, but maybe taking the next step. So you talked about how we have to defend our civil liberties and we have to come together with community groups, minority groups. All of that, all of this rhetoric in the last 10 years after 9/11 has really put us on the defensive, and all of that is actually defending our community. And I'm wondering if it's too soon to talk about creating a vision for the future. So what does American society look like with the Muslim community embrace, or the Arab world and the Muslim world in sort of more stable position? Is it too soon to talk about that? If it's not, where do we start? What do you think?
Okay. Well, the question about Zionism, I think, is a very important one. And the question of how do we talk about the part that Israel has played in fomenting Islamophobia, how do we talk about right-wing Zionism and so on without alienating Jewish allies? I mean, first and foremost, the Jewish left has already done this, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are tons of people in the Jewish left who have written about this. There are activists in this room who have spoken out against Islamophobia. The group Jews Against Islamophobia is one of the sponsors of this group. And so we have to ally with people who agree that this is a problem and who will stand with us side by side and argue that solidarity is the basis, really, for fighting against any form of oppression, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Now, I've been on a bunch of interviews, and one of the things, when there's a conservative as well on the platform, one of the things they'll throw out is they'll say, well, anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the United States. And my response is always the same, which is, why should that surprise us? It's always been the case that when Muslims have been targeted in Europe, so have Jews. When Muslims were driven out of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, Jews were expelled in 1492. When all sorts of heretics were prosecuted and persecuted by the Vatican in the context of the Inquisition, Jews moved and migrated to the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Ottoman Empire, where they were tolerated and where many of them went on to progress and so on. So this idea that somehow Muslims and Jews have always been enemies is not true. In fact, the idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition is fairly new compared to the Muslim-Judeo connection, which spans more than a millennium. So I think we have to tell the truth about what history has involved, and we have to talk, for instance, and the truth when it comes to the question of Islamophobia is that actually in Zionism, there hasn't been, in its origins, any sort of systematic demonization of Muslims or even of Arabs. If there was a demonization, it was of all Gentiles, right, who stood in the way of this project of creating a religiously exclusive state. This language starts to change largely in the 60s and 70s in the context of the birth of the PLO and various radical groups that then start to use force and violence as a means to achieve national liberation. That's when the notion of the Arab terrorist comes into being in the Israeli context. And Israel is very loud in advocating this notion on the world stage. So for instance, in 1972, after the Munich incident, where the group Black September was responsible for killing Israeli athletes in Munich, the UN General Assembly calls a meeting where they talk about this notion of terrorism. And there's a clear split. On the one hand are the non-aligned countries. These are countries that have gone through national liberation struggles, and they argue that force is justified in the pursuit of national liberation. And then you have the West, which says, okay, you have a right to self-determination, but violence and force can only be used by the state, right? And so what happens after that is that in 1979, Benjamin Netanyahu, at the head of a group known as the Jonathan Institute, holds the first international counterterrorism conference in Jerusalem. And his father, Ben-Zion, who gives the keynote address, he says, well, these terrorists claim to be acting in the interests of self-determination and national liberation, but in fact, the IRA, the PLO, and so on are nothing but rotten terrorists. They're just like the Nazis. So this is actually one of the sources of this notion of Islamofascism that comes into being much later. And of course, what starts off as a conference in '79 in Jerusalem, to which there are dignitaries from around the world who have been invited. In 1984, it is held in Washington, D.C. And at this point, there's an entire section on Islamic terrorism. Bernard Lewis is present at this particular conference. And what you see is a shift from the Arab terrorist to the Islamic terrorist. Why? Well, there are some internal shifts in Israeli society, the rise of the far right, the electoral victory in the late 70s for the Likud party, and the shift generally in politics rightwards. But also externally, you've seen by this point the Iranian Revolution of 1979, you've seen the beginnings of Hezbollah, and later on in the decade, you see the birth of Hamas. And so now, for the Likud right, Islam becomes an existential threat. And so this language gets developed in collaboration, by the way, with the neoconservatives. I'm not making this up. Go and check out from the library the two conference proceedings, which are authored by Benjamin Netanyahu, and you will see that the language gets developed in this way. So I think we have to tell the truth, and we have to show that the way in which to fight against racism, whatever form it may be, involves solidarity, and we shouldn't be afraid to hurt people's feelings. I've already spoken a lot, but very quickly, the question of material support is just horrible. And in relation to the question of how do we overturn these laws, I mean, let's take the case of COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was this notorious FBI program that was used back in the 1950s and 60s by the Hoover administration to infiltrate and spy on the civil rights movement. People know that Martin Luther King was spied upon. It was used to spy against the New Left, people in SDS, feminists, and so on and so forth, and it made people's lives miserable. It was ended. When was it ended? It was ended in the 1970s, and you read the way in which the judge who ends this talks about it, and he says, this is abominable, this is un-American, we can't have these kind of spying programs. Why? If you look back, it is the movements of the 1960s and 70s that had everything to do with ending COINTELPRO. Right? Because what the movements did is it created a generational shift, and it created a sense in which people cannot be persecuted for their political views. And that's the climate in which ultimately these laws were put to rest. The decline of these movements, the rise of the far right, particularly the new right and Reagan and so on, has meant that we have now gone in the opposite direction. And that's why I keep emphasizing that rather than simply go pull a lever and hope that the Democratic Party will do the right thing, we have to build movements from below. We have to build grassroots movement. So what's the vision? The vision, I think, is in the short term, we have to fight every single manifestation of anti-Muslim racism. We have to link arms in solidarity with other racially oppressed minorities. And internationally, we have to cut against Islamophobia and the othering of Muslims in other parts of the world, and really, fundamentally, ultimately, create a society in which racism does not have to exist, war does not have to exist, empire does not have to exist, and where human beings can live in equality and peace with one another.